Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Philipp Ivanov. I'm the CEO of Asia Society Australia. Welcome to our final executive briefing for 2020, in which we'll review how this year has altered our local, regional, and global realities and what we can expect in 2021. Before we begin, Asia Society acknowledges that many participants in today's event are dialing in from locations that have traditional owners and custodians. Today I'm speaking to you from Melbourne, from the land of Boon Wurrung and Wurundjeri peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation. I acknowledge their traditional honours and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to welcome and acknowledge any Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander or First Nations people joining our webcast today. Well, what a year. 2020 has seen Australia and most countries in our region and beyond caught in the perfect storm of public health, economic, geopolitical, and environmental headwinds. COVID-19 has been dominating motive of the year. It has changed, continues to change our economy, our politics, and society, and will have a long-lasting impact on Australia, Asia, and the rest of the world. Continuing deterioration of the US-China relations and China's increasingly assertive foreign policy have accelerated, prompting further rethink of China policy in most major capitals of the world. And Australia is no exception. In fact, in many ways, Australia has been both at the sharp end of China's more assertive and less tolerant foreign policy and a global pioneer in building its domestic resilience and mobilizing global coalitions in response to it. As a result, Australia-China political and trade relations have deteriorated significantly during 2020, and with no high-level political contacts and the introduction by China of punitive trade measures against 13 Australian industries. US elections and the victory of Joe Biden was another defining moment of 2020, which gives a glimmer of hope for the US to start solving its deep domestic problems and re-engage more proactively and consistently globally. Two important trade agreements have been concluded: Indonesia-Australia Economic Partnership Agreement and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, opening new opportunities for Australia to get serious about its trade diversification. Finally, and perhaps less visible, Australia continued investing in building its key Indo-Pacific partnerships, economic, political, and strategic, with India, Japan, Vietnam, and Southeast Asia more broadly, providing the ballast to our Asia partnerships and seeking to maintain a united front to keep our region's economic and security order based on rules. We at Asia Society Australia have responded to this complex environment by significantly ramping up our activities, keeping our members, our broader community informed, connected, and actively engaged. In fact, on all indicators this year, we have done more than we have ever done in our over 20 years in Australia. We delivered over 83 programs with over 7,000 registrations and 26,000 views on YouTube. We have established the Asia Society Policy Institute in Australia, the first overseas hub of our policy institute outside the United States. We have significantly expanded our analysis and publications with over 56 articles and essays, including 2 major reports. And together with the Business Council of Australia, we established the Asia Task Force, which has been crafting policy and business solutions to help re-energize Australian business engagement in Asia and contribute to our national economic recovery. We have more than doubled our media and social media footprint in 2020. And of course, we have managed a considerable financial pressure, and we did it reasonably well. But as many nonprofits, we have been affected by the recession. Now, we couldn't have done it all without you and without your support, especially our members and partners who power our work every day. So a big thank you from all of us for supporting and staying with us. Your membership keeps Australia informed and engaged with the region. And to all our viewers, listeners, and subscribers, thank you for tuning in and participating and being a part of our community. I also want to thank our board and advisory council, and of course, our very talented team for their incredibly hard work. There is much more to be done. Australia and the region are facing historic geopolitical, economic, and social challenges, and to address them, Australia will need to work with Asia, making our mission more relevant than ever. I'll now pass on to today's moderator and the Executive Director for Policy, Richard Maude, who will go through order of proceedings and introduce our speakers. Have a great Christmas and Happy New Year, and I'll see you hopefully in much better 2021.
Thanks so much, Philip. And on behalf of the Asia Society Australia team, thanks also for your leadership during an incredibly difficult year. So as Philip said, so much of truly global consequences happened this year that we thought for Asia Society Australia's very final event for the year that we should reflect on what we've seen over the year and also look forward to what might be coming. It's a very human reaction to want desperately to get to the end of this year. I know I do. But I've got a very strong feeling that next year will be just as tumultuous and difficult to manage. And clearly, for a start, there's a very long way to go to tame the pandemic and to recover from the economic damage it's caused. So there's a lot to talk about, and we have a stellar panel lined up to do so. We're going to work our way through a moderated discussion, which I'll lead, but we do want to try and make this interactive as we can over this system. So if you have a question, please add it into the YouTube chat box at any time, and I'll try to get to them as many of them as I can. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Today we have with us my colleague Wendy Cutler. Wendy is Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute and also Managing Director of the Institute's office in Washington, DC. And Wendy joined ASPI after nearly 3 decades as a senior diplomat and negotiator in the Office of the US Trade Representative. We also have Bates Gill. Bates is a professor of Asia-Pacific Security Studies at Macquarie University, and he's also the inaugural scholar in residence at Asia Society Australia, and it's great to be working with Bates. Bates has a 30-year career as a scholar, policy advisor, and author, with a strong focus on Asia-Pacific politics, foreign policy and security, and China and US-China relations. And I'm also delighted that Jenny Gordon can join us today. Jenny is the Chief Economist in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Canberra. And in that role, she provides economic analysis to support DFAT policy and program development across trade, investment, foreign policy, and development assistance. Now, I've just given you the very, very briefest of bios from these 3 distinguished colleagues. So if you want more information on each of them, you can click on the link to the full speaker bios in the chat box. So Wendy, Bates, and Jenny, a warm welcome to you all. So let's start the discussion. And I wanted to begin with an open-ended question, really. I wanted to ask each of you what you thought the COVID-19 pandemic tells us about our world. And perhaps we could go in this order, Wendy, Bates, and Jenny.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. And it's really my honor to be joining you for, I guess, which is your last event of this year. So congratulations to Philip and you for really delivering such a rich program this year. And clearly 2020 has been a really tough year. And Bates and Jenny, I really look forward to the discussion. You know, from my perspective, I think what COVID-19 really revealed was how interconnected we are. I mean, if this had happened 30 years ago, I don't think that the whole world would be living through a global pandemic the way we are. And clearly the United States, we are still in a very intense phase of the pandemic. I'm hopeful with a vaccine, you know, we can see the light at the end of the tunnel, but we're going to have a tough few months coming up, according to all press reports. With this interconnection, however, I think really reveals our vulnerabilities And that's what I wanted to share with everyone. And I think what we're seeing is countries and the private sector recognizing their overdependence on either a single source of supply or on a single country for essential medicines or medical equipment. And so I think this is going to have a lasting impact as the private sector and the public sector try and work through how they're going to be prepared, not only for the next pandemic or health crisis, but maybe, a climate related event or other natural disasters. Finally, I would just say, I think on the positive side, it's really demonstrated the importance of digitalization, not just with respect to e-commerce, but to services. The fact we can be doing this kind of event from Australia and the United States all day. I've been on other webinars with friends from Europe and Asia, and it's working incredibly well. I keep thinking if this pandemic had hit us the way that it had 10 years ago, it would have been a completely different story. But I do feel connected with my colleagues. I don't think that digitalization is just about being able to work, but we're seeing health and education and e-payments and all of that. And I think it's just accelerating that trend to digitalization, and there's really no turning back.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. And I think that last point is really marked, not just in the developed world, but as you know, I've been looking at Southeast Asia over the past 6 months, and it's really quite striking there too, the way in which digitization has really accelerated and has quite really important implications for the future development of their economy and the types of investments they need to make now. Bates.
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard. And let me just first of all thank Philip and the entire Asia Society. It's been a great year, and I'm very honored to be the inaugural scholar in residence, and I'm very much looking forward to continuing this work with all of you through this year and into next. Let me pick up on that theme of acceleration, because I think that's a theme I think we want to draw from as we think about the impact of COVID-19. So much of what we have seen unfold this year, I think, has been an acceleration of trends that were in many ways already in train, already in place. And I think, unfortunately, while there are some positive aspects to that, like increasing digitization of economies and societies, I think we can point to some darker aspects of it, unfortunately. For example, US-China relations were already in a downward spiral, we could say, and that was only accelerated, I think, by the outbreak of COVID-19, the Trump administration's efforts to pin blame on China, but also I think China's effort to point to the foibles and failures of the United States in a way that has not been helpful to the relationship either. Even a more global effort to try and decouple, or at least become more interdependent from China, was also become less dependent upon China, was also well underway prior to January of 2020. And if anything, this has accelerated that. And relatedly, again, sticking with the China theme and trends already underway, as Philip flagged, already around the world, there were some real deep revisitation, deep questioning, rethinking going on about the geostrategic relationship countries want to have with China. And I think the upheaval of COVID-19, some of the reactions that we've seen coming out of Beijing, wolf warrior diplomacy, for example, and many other aspects of the Chinese response, I think have only further underscored concerns in capitals around the world about the direction that China's taking, both domestically as well as internationally. So we come to the end of 2020 now. Looking ahead, I think we'll probably have a chance to talk about this, but a lot more problematic and challenging days ahead for our relations with China and for China's relations with the world.
Yeah, thanks, Bates. We definitely want to come out and come back and tease out some of those China questions. So we'll just leave that thought there and we'll come back to that. And then, so Jenny.
I agree with the COVID as an accelerant, really, accelerant on digital, but and also on the sort of pressures for decoupling. But one of the other things it did, it revealed a lot of the flaws in our systems. So you just have to look at the US health system. It really revealed the entrenched inequality. And so, looking at health outcomes, you see the challenges there. Also the inequality in terms of who lost their jobs. So who are the most vulnerable workers? And governments did respond, many governments anyway. But it actually then raises that question of why did we have that problem in the first place? And so it's revealed a lot of our sort of fundamental problems that have led to populism that we need to worry about. So we can't just think about, it's not going back to what we were. It's not kind of trying to get back to where we were. We really need to be thinking about how we use this crisis to change the trajectory that we were on prior to the crisis. Decoupling is really interesting. So as an economist, I kind of thought as long as, countries were really nicely intermeshed, you kind of had they wouldn't go to trade war with each other because they were too economically interdependent. And so decoupling kind of raises the risk. But it's quite interesting because, in fact, the global trade system held up remarkably well. I mean, yes, there were a lot of disruptions in the short run, but really when you started trying to identify for Australia, for example, it was global shortage of PPE. Suddenly the demand for PPE went from, sort of pretty normal to hundreds, thousands fold increase in demand. And so just ramping up, even if you didn't have the supply chain sort of question, is another issue. And the interesting thing too is that firms can be just as vulnerable from a firm, not being able to produce in their own country as they are vulnerable to not being able to import it from somewhere else. So we actually need to be really clear on where the vulnerability lies in terms of disruption to supply chains. It's not always just in, through global relations, at least when the disruptor is something like a disease. When a disruptor is a political thing, as Australia has found with trade, that's a very different issue. But it does make us very aware of those supply chain vulnerabilities.
Can I just pop in a quick follow-up question? You said that it revealed underlying problems like inequality, some of the impacts of globalization. Do you see around the world the political consensus that's going to be needed to address some of those changes?
I think we actually need domestic consensuses first. I mean, inequality is largely a domestic problem. It's inequality at a domestic level, because what we've seen because of the massive growth in income in many Asian countries in particular, we've seen a reduction in global inequality, sort of cross countries. But what we've seen is within countries, the rise in inequality for a wide range of reasons, but often to do with how markets work and then political dynamics and power dynamics, and history as well. So I actually think that we need domestic solutions for this. But I think that, having international institutions where, the right strategies, appropriate ways to go forward, discussed can be really helpful and can kind of encourage countries to make the domestic changes that they need to make.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. Wendy, can I come back to you? So Philip mentioned, of course, that other than the pandemic, perhaps the most consequential event this year has been the US election. And for all of us who, live and breathe international relations and foreign policy, we were, of course, fixed on the campaign for what seemed like an endless period of time, and the outcome and the aftermath. And so now we are wondering what comes next. And of course, there's an awful lot written and being spoken about what we might expect from the Biden administration on foreign policy. And in many ways, of course, we can't know. They're going to have to get into the job and feel their way. But, how do you see a Biden foreign policy shaping up?
Well, yeah, and I would just kind of also say that we're going through a transition now, and so President Trump is in office until January 20th, and from now to that period, there's also a concern about additional measures that can be taken between now and then. But when we look at what a Biden administration might look like, they're, based on what he and his team have said so far, I think is fairly encouraging on the foreign policy side. And that is a real emphasis on working with allies and partners and through international organizations to achieve US economic and foreign policy objectives. And that's, basically saying that it's going to no longer be kind of this go it alone approach, and that, there'll be a real emphasis on rebuilding some relationships, like particularly with Europe. I think with Australia, we've had good relations, so we'll work to strengthen them. But I think a real emphasis on that. But, let's just be, if I can be kind of straight on this, I think it will also, for this to work, it's going to require our allies and partners also stepping up to the plate as well. I think it's, we're going to, it's not going to be necessarily smooth sailing, but I think the team he's bringing on to do foreign policy and has extensive experience and deep and extensive contacts with many people around the world. And so I think you're going to see also kind of a more nuanced US foreign policy where we're not asking our partners to choose between us and China. I think it'll be a lot more nuanced. I also think we're going to see kind of the return to a more traditional policymaking approach. And I don't want to sound like a bureaucrat here, but I think that's extremely important. It's no longer going to be policy by tweet. It's going to be policies that are well thought through, that factor in the input from our stakeholders and our Congress, and also factor in the views of our partners and allies around the world. So I think this will also contribute to a more stable and predictable policy. And finally, I'd just like to emphasize that I think we're going to see a foreign policy that's more enmeshed and connected to the US domestic policy. And in particular, I think that's been an objective of the new National Security Advisor. I just served on a task force with Jake Sullivan over the past few years. We issued a report making foreign policy work better for the US middle class. And the objective of this report was to really look at what does the US middle class want from foreign policy, and how foreign policy officials can better factor in their concerns and their priorities and have a much more integrated foreign and domestic policy. This will be a challenge to implement, but I think it's so critical, particularly when you look at the political divisions in the United States.
Thanks, Wendy. That's a great report that you're referring to. So for those of you who are interested, you'll find it on the Carnegie Endowment website. And its analysis of the way in which globalization in the form of trade competition and automation and immigration and that sense of cultural insecurity on the middle class is absolutely fascinating. And of course, it has a very strong policy section as well. Wendy, so you mentioned...
If I can add just one point on that, I think what I took away from the 3 years of serving on this task force, it was very heartening to me, and I think heartening to our partners and allies, is that the US middle class, however you define it, and lots of interviews were done, they supported US engagement in the world. It wasn't all about we need to retreat, we need to be America alone, America first. It was more about trying to reposition our stature and our position in the world. But foreign engagement was definitely something that was welcome and appreciated.
So Wendy, you mentioned the emphasis on working with allies and close partners from the Biden campaign and transition team. How do you see risks and opportunities for Australia?
Well, again, I think, the US relationship with Australia, frankly, in contrast to some of our other allies, has been pretty steady and pretty strong over the past 4 years. So I expect that to continue. I think probably the area of angst for my Australian colleagues is to try and figure out where the Biden team will come down on the China policy and how that then might affect US-Australian relations. And again, everything I'm hearing from the Biden team is that they want to work with allies and partners. They want to listen to their concerns. They want to work with them to addressing the China problem. And particularly given the difficulties that Australia is experiencing with China now, I would hope that we would be kind of an active ally working with others to support Australia through this difficult period.
All right, thanks, Wendy. Bates, well, let's go to the other major power that's gripped attention. Let's come back to China. And so you mentioned it's been a pretty tough year with China. Of course, Australia is not the only country that's been struggling with this much more assertive diplomacy. China has had a very nasty border conflict with India. It has alienated much of Europe, and of course, US-China competition has been very sharp and the relationship very tense this year. So, I mean, how do you see China's outlook on the world, the shape of its foreign policy, including in light of the fifth plenum, which was another big event, albeit one that attracted less attention, perhaps, in the US election?
We could say a few words about the fifth plenum, I guess. I mean, we don't want to get into the arcana of Communist Party politics too much, but this is an important event. It's about once every year. It convenes the full Central Committee, which is ostensibly the most important policy-making and deliberative body of the Communist Party. And typically the fifth plenum has, over the past 20 years or so at least, has looked back upon the current 5-year plan and judged, assessed, has it met its goals, and then looks forward to the next 5-year plan. Now, we're not going to see the new 5-year plan in its full text until the National People's Congress, which will be in March of next year. But there were some interesting summaries and outlines that were presented, and I think it did signal to us some things, not only about the near term, but also about the longer term trajectory for China in the world. And I'll just maybe note two important things, one on the economic side and one on the political side. I mean, economically, and probably in part driven by the COVID crisis, but I think a trajectory that was already underway, we're going to see greater and greater emphasis on China's domestic market as the more important source of China's future growth, rather than the international marketplace, which has been the case over the past couple of decades, and looking to that market to help drive technological innovation. In other words, the China market, domestic market, will be the place where a test bed, if you will, and a consumer market for new and advanced technologies that China wants to take the lead on globally, whether that's in the cyber world, in digitization, in artificial intelligence, et cetera. Now, that is in part because of this increasing concern in China about decoupling, about the challenges and the headwinds they're facing in the international marketplace as countries and societies around the globe rethink their economic dependency upon China. Now, can they pull this off? We'll have to see. Obviously, it's a huge domestic market, and there's been a lot of talk about accelerating the importance of the domestic market in China before. I think we'll have to wait and see how that goes, but this is clearly their intention, and this is what we hear talked about, the dual circulation strategy, that the internal circulation of China's market is going to become more important than the international cycle or the international circulation aspect of China's economic growth. So what does that tell us? I think China's bound and determined to drive forward in technological innovation, but not depend so much on external markets to do so. So that has huge implications, I think, for how we deal with China economically going forward. The other important outcome of the fifth plenum, just very quickly, I think, maybe not as stressed in the documents, but this is also an important political outcome. Xi Jinping's fingerprints are all over what we've seen come out of the fifth plenum. And also, interestingly, a stress, unlike previous fifth plenums, not just on the next 5-year plan, but on the next 15-year medium-term plan out to 2035. Under Xi Jinping, we see a lot more discussion about where China wants to be by 2035, a fully modernized socialist economy by that time. But you can maybe read a little bit between the lines here and begin to ask, is this because Xi Jinping intends to still be in power in 2035 so that he can take full credit for this crowning achievement that is being played up for China's goals in 2035. I think that's an entirely plausible outcome for Xi. He will only, quote unquote, only be 82 in 2035, which, by the way, is going to be Joe Biden's age in 2024. So not entirely impossible that we're going to have Xi Jinping with us for many more years to come. And I think some aspects of the fifth plenum suggest that. And for global relations, then I think we should expect to see a doubling down of some of the most concerning aspects of Chinese foreign policy that we've seen, precisely because Xi Jinping sees this as necessary in order to make the accomplishments and secure his legacy.
So, just building on that last point, how do you see that manifesting itself next year, for example, and what is your sense of the outlook for Australia-China relations?
Well, maybe we can think about Australia-China relations as a kind of proxy for the kind of relations that China is likely to have with many other, especially liberal democratic societies going forward. And I think there's going to be a great deal more skepticism and concern introduced into that relationship on both sides, both from Australia's perspective looking at China, but also China's views towards us here in Australia. So I don't think it bodes well, to be very honest. I think things could get worse, actually, before they get better. I don't think we've seen the bottom of this downward spiral yet in Australia-China relations. And I think mostly because what is apparently being demanded of Australia by Beijing in order to set the relationship on a more even keel are politically extremely difficult things for any government in Australia, let alone the current one, to undertake. And this would mean, ignoring aspects of China's domestic governance that we find distasteful, whether that's vis-a-vis the Uyghurs or vis-a-vis Hong Kong, ignoring China's more bellicose approach to Taiwan, allowing for China to accommodate, I guess, Chinese investments in Australia, which have been deemed to be too sensitive on national security grounds, et cetera, et cetera. I don't see Australia turning a corner on some of these areas of concern, and that's just going to be problematic in Beijing. So I think we should expect, certainly in the near term, for China to continue doubling down and to increase its pressures on Australia, at least in the near term. And I think other governments around the world are going to be seeing similar pressures placed on them to be more accommodating of PRC interests.
All right, well, that's a bracing thought, Bates. Maybe I won't come back from leave in January. But anyway, let's switch from China to go back to the economics. And Jenny, just interested in your thoughts on how you would grade global efforts to deal with the pandemic. So it's quite a different kind of crisis, economic crisis, to the global financial crisis of 2007 and 8. So what's your sense of how the world has done what it needs to do to meet this particular challenge?
It is really different because it was a shock on both the demand and supply side, and particularly shutdowns, shut down demand as well as shutting down supply. And that's very unusual because most of our shocks are either, demand side shocks or supply side shocks. The oil price shocks back in the 70s were supply side shocks. What we've done well is we've managed to avoid an associated financial crisis, at least so far. And that actually has been really good because at the beginning of the crisis, you did see, capital markets start pulling capital out of particularly, sort of vulnerable Asian countries. And that could have destabilized those economies substantially. But, sort of bank swaps and IMF action and others. And I think the market's realization is that it's all very well to have capital flight from so-called risky markets, but when you've got widespread, COVID every market has got more risky. So that was good. There was also cooperation in the G20 on the debt suspension initiative, which was also very important, just to take the pressure off developing economies and but how they go forward. So I agree with you, Richard. 2021 is not going to be plain sailing. It's not like okay, we're over this. We've got the vaccine and away we roll. So there's been some really interesting natural experiments. Economists love natural experiments. You sort of had Sweden going one way, you had lockdowns in other places. And what became really clear is that it wasn't health or economics. So if you didn't get your health measures right and the virus spread, you were going to have economic impacts because people self-selected. Demand, so you might have been saying, oh, well, we'll have the supply side, that's okay, it'll all tick on. But the demand side was substantially reduced, even if people weren't forced to not attend events and other things. So, really, it wasn't a clear cut. And what we found is that the countries who've done best are the ones who controlled the virus the best. And that was a really clear outcome. And really, if you think about it, it's quite challenging that, if you have movement of people and your economy relies on movement of people, so particularly industries, tourism, international tourism, really hard hit. And also higher education in Australia has been very hard hit. Quite a lot of students had already arrived before the virus, really sort of landed in Australia and in the rest of the world. And so the student numbers weren't down as much as you might have thought, given you looked at travel once the travel bans were put in place. But even so, next year again, will we see a restoration of student travel? And really, I don't think we will. So next year, the impacts on higher education might be even more severe than this year's impacts on higher education. Manufacturing and commodity exports were more resilient as long as you didn't close down your manufacturing plants because of COVID-19. So iron ore prices are very, very high right now, which is great for Australia. And that's in part because Brazil wasn't able to maintain, well, it had some other problems, but maintain its iron ore production. So the countries that have done the best were the ones who really got on top of the virus the quickest. So China, Taiwan, Vietnam have all done extremely well, given the circumstances. All of them has seen a decline in GDP growth, but they've actually probably the ones who will rebound to the fact that they won't have gone backwards over this year, whereas everybody else has pretty much gone backwards. So even though we're seeing some lovely, kind of record growth rates in the third quarter, they're not nearly catching up to what we lost in the first and the second, particularly the second quarter. So South Korea, Singapore, and Hong Kong also have rebounded fairly well, though they probably will go backwards. And all of them are actually in third waves, but they're kind of managing those third waves fairly well. The countries we really worry about a lot about the countries in the Pacific, particularly the tourism-dependent economies. They didn't get COVID, but they lost a substantial proportion of their export income and a substantial proportion of government revenue as well. So we're worrying about how recovery will go in the PICS. We're also worried about Indonesia, India, where the virus is still, as far as the data can tell, not looking nearly under control. Next year could be an opportunity for some pretty significant reforms, but you've really seen foreign investment slow dramatically because you don't get direct foreign investment if you can't have people come and assess the opportunities. And so those countries, until they really get the virus under control, are going to be not in great shape. And then some of the others, Thailand relies a lot on tourism, so it's also challenging. So what you've got is, depending on the nature of your economy, the different impacts, coming through on the demand side through the international markets are really important. But then domestically, it's really about virus control, and it's about getting that going. So what's our scorecard for the global economy? Pretty awful, really. It hasn't been a good year. Nobody can say it's been a good year. and looking forward, recovery is going to take some time. I think we're a bit optimistic. People hear of vaccines, but just the sheer logistical challenge of rolling out vaccines across the world, which is until your neighbours are vaccinated, you can't travel easily. So these are the sorts of things that are going to hold recovery at bay until we can really get movement of people going again. And then there's the potential ramifications of, sort of people closing down their economies and sort of deciding that they want to hunker down and, relocate production onshore and so losing the very things that were giving them the income gains to trade. And that's very worrying that we might go down that pathway.
So Jenny, clearly a very long way to go, but what implications for Australia would you draw at this stage, looking at that global outlook and what you're seeing in Asia?
Well, we've been running record trade surpluses, current account surpluses, due to very high iron ore prices and the fact that China is still purchasing our iron ore. The sort of trade war and that's been going on across a number of commodities aside, that's been, things are looking great, but it's kept our exchange rate very strong, which makes it harder for us to be competitive in other markets. But for us, commodity exports are less affected by the virus. Recovery strategies that are heavy on infrastructure are always very good for Australia because they increase the demand for steel, which increases the demand for the things we're really good at producing. But I think more generally, it's going to be the pace of global recovery overall, because that's where you get the export-led growth in China and Taiwan, Korea. They're looking for demand to recover in their major markets. And if demand takes a long time to recover in their major markets, then the demand that they have for our products will also be lower. So that's, we really rely on global recovery as much as we rely on recovery in our direct trading partners. Okay.
Thanks, Jenny. Wendy, I want to come back to you, not least because we have a question from an audience member. And the question is, will the World Trade Organization have a role in a future bipolarized global community in setting international trade rules? And what about digitalization in that context?
Well, clearly the WTO has a lot of challenges on its plate as well. And these challenges didn't just surface this year. Frankly, they've been building up for a while. Challenges that are presented both with respect to the WTO's negotiation agenda, with respect to its dispute settlement function and its monitoring function. In addition, there's no leader of the World Trade Organization because the US is effectively blocking consensus of an African candidate, Dr. Ngozi, who's extremely well qualified. My personal hope is that the Biden administration will, when they take office, that soon thereafter, they will lift that block and we will be able to offer our support to Dr. Ngozi, because I think it's extremely important that we have a new leader of the WTO at the helm, given the huge substantive agenda and reform agenda that the WTO needs to tackle. One of the key issues that the WTO is working on is the issue of e-commerce and digital trade. There's a plurilateral going on now among a subset of WTO members, about 80 members the last time I counted, which is co-chaired by Australia and Japan and Singapore. They're making some progress, but I think there are some very difficult issues given that both China is a member of this group and has very different views on the free flow of data, for example, than the US and other countries. But also the US has very different views than the EU when it comes to privacy. So the question is, how can you light a fire under these e-commerce negotiations? Because it is kind of strange to think that with all of the trade going on in the digital world, the WTO has no existing rules on trade in this space. It's quite, the WTO is quite behind the curve on all of this. And so one of my thoughts is that the US should work with other like-minded countries and try and come up with a digital trade deal that draw upon what the US has done with Canada, Mexico, and Japan, what Australia and Singapore have done, and what New Zealand, Chile, and Singapore have done. In other words, there are a lot of threads in this area and a lot of different agreements have emerged. And I think if we could move and really do a digital trade deal, that this would really light a fire under the process in Geneva, which I fear can just get bogged down for year after year. And how do you explain the relevance of a World Trade Organization to a population when it has no rules on, again, such a growing component of trade?
Thanks, Wendy. Now, while you've got the floor, I just wanted to ask you about US-China economic relationships. So clearly this has been a major source of tension. And one thing that we will be watching very closely in Australia, of course, is how President Biden might approach the phase one trade deal that was struck under the Trump administration, what might happen to tariffs, export controls, and to the technology restrictions that are now progressively being put in place. So how do you see that playing out?
Well, you're right. I mean, President-elect Biden is going to inherit again a lot of tariffs and export controls and frankly other sanctions against Chinese entities that he'll need to decide, does he keep them in place? Does he phase them out over time? Does he do many kind of packages with China to lift some of this? So that's going to be on his plate. Just last week, he announced that he's not going to be taking any fast steps on tariffs, that he will review them, and he'll also consult with allies and partners as he looks at these tariffs. So I would also just posit, just given the strong bipartisan support for being tough on China and the fact that I think that according to the latest Pew poll, 70% of Americans have an unfavorable view of China. I think that the president-elect is going to be hard pressed to kind of lift any of these measures without getting something in return from China. So I think we're going to live in this world for a while. I'm hoping, though, that particularly with respect to tariffs, for example, that more exclusions can be given to US companies and workers that are hurting from these tariffs because, let's be honest, China's not paying for these tariffs. US importers are paying for them. And so, he's just going to have a lot on his plate with respect to China. But that's why I think kind of an overall China strategy is needed. Up until now, we've seen over the past 4 years, and particularly over the past few months, just sanction after sanction, measure after measure against China. It's not clear what the end game is. And I think when it comes to technology and trade, we need to be a lot more strategic about what we're trying to accomplish in these areas. Someone mentioned, I think early on, Bates, you were talking about decoupling. Are we really seeking a full decoupling, or is it a more targeted decoupling? And in certain technologies, that makes sense, but that doesn't mean that the whole relationship needs to separate. So I think these questions need to be addressed in the context of a broader strategy with China, frankly, that also includes a cooperation aspect, because let's be honest, there's some serious global challenges, whether it be climate change or pandemics or vaccines, where we're going to need to work with China. I know some of our allies and partners are worried that we may tip the scale in cooperation and then trade off some of the other kind of differences we have with China, but I don't think that's in the cards. I think it's clear what our Congress is expecting, what our public is expecting. And if anything, I think this is an issue where our Congress is going to remain just very, very tough and strong and continue to maintain kind of a bipartisan coalition to really press the administration to stay tough.
Thanks, Wendy. Bates, I think this is a good point for you to come back into the conversation. So the trade and economic issues, of course, are just one part of a US-China relationship that's become much more sharply competitive. And you touched on this in your earlier remarks, but how do you see the overall outlook for US-China relations next year? And what role do you see for middle powers like Australia, Japan, and India?
Well, if we just look out, say, a year from now, I don't think we're going to see much in the way of improvement. I mean, one of the reasons, of course, is that the Biden administration is going to be so fully and rightly focused on the domestic situation. Well, I think one interesting outcome of all of this may be that at least in the early months of that, in the first 100 or 200 days, you won't see that sort of typical presidential swing, through Asia, and instead he's going to feel very politically compelled to stay focused on developments at home. But in the meantime, I think we're going to continue to see then this reluctance that Wendy was noting, reluctance or even resistance against any sort of accommodating posture toward China. So I don't see anything in the way of serious improvement. And it could even be a worsening depending on decisions which China chooses to take over the course of the next year, whether that's vis-a-vis Taiwan, vis-a-vis Uyghurs, or in Hong Kong, or in the South China Sea, all sorts of sensitive areas where China could act that would merely worsen what's already a deteriorating set of relationship. So how's that going to affect Australia? Well, I think, yes, we're going to see in this new administration in the United States a greater degree of partnering, looking to partner, seeking support and listening to allies and partners, Australia being right at the top of that list for the United States in terms of our relations in the Indo-Pacific. And I think overall that's a good thing. Hopefully that can be linked up with somewhat of a grander strategy to work with allies in ways that can counterbalance unwelcome aspects of China's rise. But I think too, especially if China continues to move in a trajectory that is more assertive and troubling, the pressure is going to mount here in Australia, coming out of Washington, to be more forthright, even more forthright, and to maybe even take some steps in tandem with others, like the United States or Japan, maybe even India, in ways that China is not going to like, and is going to perhaps be risky for Australia to take. So I think I do not see things getting much better in the next year, Richard. We're going to be continuing to face real challenges in dealing with China, and I think that's going to raise increased risks for Australia economically and politically in that relationship with Beijing.
Thanks, Bates. Now, look, we've got about 5 minutes left, and what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask Jenny about the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and I'll come to that in just 1 minute. And then I'd like to ask each of our panelists just to close by reflecting on one big thing or one or two big things they think that we should be watching in 2021. Well, of course, we've already covered many of those, but if you want to come back and highlight something. And while that you are thinking about that, we've got a question from Gordon Flake, and I'll just ask you to roll any reflections you may care to make on this question, because Gordon, it's a bit of a hand grenade with the pin pulled out, which is, Gordon says, Gordon's from the Perth US Asia Centre, very good colleague. He says, pretty sobering fare. Given the outside importance of the US role, are you pleased with the caliber of appointees announced by the Biden administration so far? I'm not sure Australia would presume to comment, Gordon, but there has been a lot of interest, obviously, on the nominations for Secretary of State and Secretary of Defence, Head of Treasury in particular. They're the ones that have to be approved by the Senate, of course. So, Jenny, just quickly coming to you, we've had a bad year on trade with China, a very bad year, but as Philip mentioned, we have done 2 big trade deals, one with Indonesia, we finalised an RCEP. So how important is RCEP to Australia as a big regional trade agreement?
I think these RCEP, which took a long time to negotiate, and India was almost over the line and then pulled out at the last minute, which I think was a major disappointment for everyone, because having India in was one of the kind of tempting things, I think, of being in RCEP. But I think often everybody's looking at the sort of the headline stuff of what tariff reductions we've got, what market access we've got, and RCEP, they're not huge. There's some modest improvements in market access, some modest commitments to bring down tariffs, which from my time in the Productivity Commission, we spent arguing were really bad for the countries who put them on, rather than necessarily for, as Wendy pointed out, it's the US importers and the US consumers paying for the tariffs in the US. But where these agreements are really useful is that it creates avenues for conversations and avenues for working together on more cooperation around, recognising standards, around, trade facilitation, reducing some of the barriers that face exporters and importers in actually getting things moving across borders. It's a platform. I mean, 100% agree with Wendy on digital trade and the fact that WTA is rather late to the game on that. But these provide opportunities to have these conversations and to kind of work together. So that's where, I think sometimes trade agreements are somewhat underappreciated, because it's a lot about platforms for ongoing improvements in trade facilitation. And it's just taking the friction out of the system that raises costs for both consumers and producers, and doesn't actually add much to the potential for the gains from trade. So RCEP's not going to change things overnight. It's not going to sort of, have massively, we'll suddenly start diversifying our export markets dramatically, because our exporters export where the money is, where the markets are. And they've been in China. And so it takes a while to find new markets, to establish new markets. It's a substantial investment for businesses to make. And so they have to be feeling that there's a decent sized market to be worthy to make that investment. So in many ways, what these trade agreements are about are trying to reduce those costs of making that investment in establishing new markets as well. So, it's a long way to go. And what we've got to do is work really hard to stop countries putting up barriers in the name of kind of, we've got to be self-sufficient in, PPE, or we've got to be, make sure we can produce all these things ourselves. I mean, suddenly toilet paper, saying, oh gosh, we've got to be able to produce toilet paper at home. And yet, really, we don't really like pulp and paper factories very much in our backyard. So, it's going to be hard to do some of these things, but it's a platform.
Okay, Jenny, thanks. I'm going to cut you a bit short there with apologies. So let's just do one last call of the card with any last thoughts you might want to make, and any quick comment you might want to make about the caliber of appointees. So Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, General Austin, Secretary of Defense. Wendy, remind me, who's nominated for Treasury? I've forgotten.
Janet Yellen.
Janet Yellen. All right, so let's go Bates, Wendy, and Jenny.
Well, thanks. I'll try to be very quick. Things to look at next year, and I can link that up to the caliber of appointments. I think what we see in these appointments is not a lot of flash and highly politicized choices, but rather loyalty, experience, steadiness, which is exactly what I think we need in the United States. And none of these people are going to have additional political aspirations above and beyond where they happen to be right now, which is great. So I think we should look forward to a great deal more steady-handedness and expertise. So I'm more or less happy. The one place I would look in terms of appointments, Kamala Harris. What sort of role is she going to be taking? I think we keep a close eye on her in 2021. Let's not forget, she's the heir presumptive now. And so they've got 4 years to get her in a place that she can win in 2024. So it'll be very interesting to see how he utilizes that appointment.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think the steadiness, the expertise, and really the relationships that they bring to the table underscores really the strength of the foreign policy team. And while we were on this webinar, my phone has been flashing that President Biden's supposedly going to announce Catherine Tai as the next U.S. trade representative, who's someone I've worked with extensively when she was at USTR. She's now the trade counsel for the House Ways and Means Committee and was instrumental in bringing Democrats and Republicans together to pass the USMCA with unprecedented support. So I think this is just another kind of nomination along those lines. She'll be steady, she'll be professional, she brings trade expertise and a lot of relationships. So I'm very heartened by these appointments. And frankly, as an American, I'm really proud, and I'm looking forward to this team, really, even though they're going to be focusing on a lot of domestic issues, they're going to have to walk and chew gum at the same time. And so I think you're going to see, just a real strong engagement by the United States on all of these issues internationally.
Thanks, Wendy. Jenny, any last thought you'd like to leave us with?
No, just it's wonderful how globalization works, because it's lovely to see Celia Rouse, who is an old classmate of mine at Harvard, be selected as the head of the Council of Economic Advisors. So you kind of end up with diaspora all around the world of great people, and it's just it shows that how Australians getting out there and building those connections, and we have these connections all over the place. So, but I agree with Bates and Wendy. It looks like a very good, stable set of what do they call them? Safe hands.
Thanks, Jenny. Well, look, I've managed to make us 2 minutes late, for which apologies, but we had such a terrific conversation. I really want to thank Wendy, Bates and Jenny for joining us. I can't think of a better way to end Asia Society Australia's formal programming for the year. I want to thank, as Philip did, all Asia Society Australia's supporters and members for their support during this year and for joining us for many events. I want to wish all members of the Asia Society global family the best wishes for the end of the year. And to all of our viewers and listeners joining us, it has been a very tough year. All over the world, many people and families have done it really hard. So we do hope that you have some opportunity to rest towards the end of the year. Australians are looking forward to a summer break, and in the Northern Hemisphere, well, I always liked the fact that it occasionally snowed on Christmas and the New Year period in America and Europe. So we hope that you have a nice white Christmas and end of the year. So look, that's it. That's all we have time for. So thanks very much for joining us, and we'll see you in 2021. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.